with Henrico County Public Schools, and we are elated to have you here with us this evening as we talk about embracing my superpower, living in the in between, which is in a phenomenally titled piece that is coming to us from a very special guest speaker. And we're going to have Suja Amir later on introduce our guest speaker. But this program is part of our Cultural Heritage Series, particularly as we celebrate AAPI, or Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So we are so happy to have you here with us this evening. Some things to remember whenever we conduct these types of virtual programs, we like to remind our audience members to remain muted unless you're being asked to unmute. Please type questions and or encouragements into the chat, and it will be posted on the EDO YouTube channel. So speaking of social media, follow us on social media. You can find us on Twitter at Henrico EDO, on Instagram, HCPS Equity. We are also on Facebook, and we have a website, Equity, Diversity, and Opportunity website, which is accessible via the Henrico County Public Schools website. So we encourage you to follow us, to like, and so we thank you for that. Just so that we can follow the order of today's program, we have introductions. We will talk about the strategic alignment from Henrico County Public Schools as it relates to our Cultural Heritage Series months. We'll do a quick recap on some of the Heritage Series that we've done so far. We'll have an introduction of our guest speaker, followed by a Q&A and some closing remarks. And if you are posting about this event, we ask that you on Twitter follow us at Henrico EDO, and you can hashtag salute AAPI. So briefly to introduce the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Opportunity. I'm not sure if she's on the call just yet, but our Chief of Equity, Diversity, and Opportunity is Dr. Monica Manns. She's an amazing asset and leader for our team. As I said earlier, Tiffany Lewis, and the coordinator for culturally responsive learning. We have Leslie Brown on the call, our admin assistant who keeps EDO running and moving and alive and well. We have Mr. Xavier Bessie, who's our student voice coordinator, and Suja Amir, who is our newest addition to the team. She is our immigrant and refugee student outreach coordinator, who is also a very, very amazing professional. I could not ask for a better team of colleagues to work with. We are small, but we like to say that we are mighty, and we really believe in the work that we're doing and how we're supporting our students, staff, and families and community members through HCPS. So just to kind of ground some of this work, oftentimes we have people who ask questions about, the Office of EDO or how we premise this work. And so Destination 2025, the plan for HCPS, is actually our county's strategic plan for Henrico County Public Schools. And so from 2018 to 2025, these are the actual strategic goals that all of our work is based on. And not just our work, but all of the other aspects of HCPS as well. And so you can see there that there are cornerstones that align in this. We have safety and wellness, we have academic growth, relationships, and then we also have as an actual cornerstone that's recognized equity and opportunity. And when we talk about equity and opportunity, we're specifically talking about equity, we're talking about fairness, we're talking about opportunity, and we're talking about diversity, but we speak in diversity in terms of inclusivity and belonging. And so for our Cultural Heritage Series, we recognize 4 cultural heritage months out of the school year. And these recognitions really relate to what students asked of us a couple of years ago, but they also relate to our more represented demographics of students within our district. And so we celebrate Black History Month or African American Heritage Month in February. We celebrate AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month in May. We celebrate Hispanic Latinx Heritage Month in September, well, from September 15th to October 15th. And then we also celebrate Native American Indigenous Peoples Month during the month of November. And when we say celebrate, we're talking in terms of these types of programs, these virtual programs that are offered from our office, but we also provide quite a bit of training to our school leaders, to our division leaders, and to our teachers about how these cultures are supposed to be properly integrated into our student content and curriculum throughout the school year. So we encourage our teachers, we train our teachers on how to properly integrate in an attributive way all of these different types of cultures and backgrounds, and making room even for the cultures and backgrounds that are not represented in our heritage series months, but making sure that students know that they are seen and that they are heard, and that they have that space to learn and to explore about their cultures and those of their peers. So as you see on the screen, we have some of the program flyers of events that we've held in the past, similar to the one tonight. So we had a homegrown Henrico panel, homegrown Black Henrico panel that featured notable African Americans who were graduates of Henrico County. We've had, in collaboration with the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, we've hosted a Pocahontas Reframed Film Festival, which was a virtual film festival that we hosted this past year. We've done a plethora of things, from bringing in professionals and having people speak from various career fields. And just 2 nights ago, Mr. Xavier Bessie, led one of our AAPI events for this month. And that entailed a book study talk with a group of our equity ambassador students who did a phenomenal job talking about myth versus reality. And they focused it on the book, The Making of Asian America by Dr. Erica Lee. And so they talked about all the things that they learned from that particular book study that they've been studying over the course of this year. So we're really, really proud of the work that we produce from this office. So, along with our heritage series, we do lots of other things. But one of the things that we really have really linked and aligned to our work is our culturally responsive education model, which we refer to as the CRIM. And the culturally responsive education model was developed in 2019. And this was developed by all HCPS stakeholders. We had input from students, from parents and family members, from staff members, from community members, on exactly how we wanted our curriculum to reflect those things that we talked about in our strategic plan. And so the culturally responsive education model, we refer to it as a wheel. The center of the wheel deals with self-reflection for the intent of creating a culture of belonging in our schools and in all of our spaces. So we talk about like what belonging looks like in the classroom, but not just in the classroom, but what does belonging feel like in the front office or in the cafeteria or on the bus ramp even. And having our school leaders and our teachers really talk about that and dissect that to make sure that we're providing the best possible educational experience for our students. And so then there are other components on the CRIM wheel: content integration, knowledge construction, prejudice reduction, equity pedagogy, and empowering school culture. And these components together are the lens that we apply to our Henrico learner profile and our deeper learning model. So this model, the CRIM framework, is a lens, again, that we apply to our existing academic curricular models as well. So that shows the way that this work is really integrated throughout the curriculum and throughout instructional design and delivery. And with that said, I am now going to turn the program over to a very amazing colleague of mine who I have not known long because she recently joined our team. But every time I speak with her, I'm so inspired. I just walk away feeling better. And that is Mrs. Suja Amir. And Suja's going to come and introduce our amazing guest speaker. So I know that we are in for a treat, and I'm going to pass it on over to Suja now.
Thank you, Tiffany. And, it's been so great working with you guys. The work you guys do is just gives me so much hope. And you guys just raise the bar all the time and all the awards you guys win. And so thank you so much for that great introduction. Now to Archana. So Archana Patek, she's a scholar activist committed to visioning, creating, and sustaining a just, inclusive world. She's academically trained in culture and communication. She frames her work around the stories that we tell and are told about identity and privilege. She's done diversity and social justice work for over 20 years. As a diasporic feminist, her integrated approach explores the ways in which we can be the change we wish to see in the world by fully exploring how systems of oppression function and building skills to disrupt and dismantle those systems. Utilizing scholarly and community justice models, she explores the ways in which critical self-reflexivity begins and centers a journey of transformative social change. Dr. Patek serves as a faculty in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, affiliate faculty in the Department of African American Studies, and the Media, Art, and Women's Studies, Media, Art, and Text Interdisciplinary Doctorate Program at VCU. She currently serves as a special assistant for programs and initiatives in the VCU Office of Institutional Equity, Effectiveness, and Success. And just a little bit about how I met her. She actually came and spoke at an event. I'm on the board of the ACLU Virginia several years ago. And I was just blown away. And I've been a fangirl of Archana ever since, and we've become friends. And I just am so happy for her to be here and speak on this amazingly titled issue that we all know about, being in between. So Archana, welcome, and go ahead and begin. You're muted.
Yeah, I know. I caught it. Thank you, Suja, for that absolutely wonderful introduction. And thank you to the entire team at Richmond County Public Schools for inviting me to speak on this topic. This is a passion project for me, and I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation with all of you. And I'm really hoping that it is a conversation. And I started with thanking Suja, but I want to point out that Suja is probably one of the people that I admire most in Richmond and in Henrico County, and all the work that she herself has been doing around social justice for our communities, and how important that is, and always open to the hard questions and the hard conversations. So she's somebody who definitely models some of the work that I talk about all the time. So I'm excited to do this conversation with all of you, to engage with all of you, and I hope that we can all be in conversation today rather than me talking at you. So, but that said, I'm going to jump in and do a little bit of an introduction and talk a little bit about the ideas that I want to share with you, and then I'll open it up so we can have a conversation. Suja, can I just get a quick time check from you? If I go for about 20, 30 minutes, are we good? And then we can have engagement?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're good.
Okay, great. All right, so the title of my presentation is Embracing My Superpower, Living in the In-Between. And it's based on, it's the same title of my TED talk that I did with Grace Street Women's TED several years ago now, pre-pandemic times. And so I'm going to give a version of that talk, but actually expand it a little bit, given the ways in which time has changed. Things have changed over time for us as a society here in the United States. And I really do want to first start by taking a minute to acknowledge that it has been a very, very difficult couple of weeks. We have had some incredible violence and loss in our society, and that has touched very close to home for many of us. And so I know for those of you who are online today, who are students and the parents of students, it's been a very scary time. And I recognize that. And I know that what we're about to talk about may be triggering in some ways, may make the conversation a bit harder. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I hope that we can be in conversation. And I'm open to having conversation about all kinds of things, not just the themes that I address in this conversation today. So I just wanted to start there. So a little bit about myself and a little bit of my own background. I I am a 1.5er, and many of you may not have heard that term, but 1.5ers are the children of immigrants who were born in their immigrant parents' homeland, but raised in the new home that the parents migrated to. And they came to the US usually, this term is usually US migrant populations, came to the US in their early childhood. So their identity development process was hey, Suja, did I went away, it said I went away for a second. Am I back?
You froze. Now you're back.
You're
Okay.
back.
I don't know
what happened.
Neither do I. It's all right. So as I was saying, my parents are immigrants. They came to the United States with their identities fully formed. They knew who they were. They had come into adulthood. They had gone through all the trials and tribulations of figuring out their personalities, their sense of self, their belongingness, etc. Of course, it did get disrupted when they came to this country, but they already had the stability of their own lived childhood experiences and their teenage experiences. And so they came into that experience of disruption as adults. That's a different game, right? My sister, on the other hand, was born in this country to those parents. So she has a great and deep sense of cultural identity and may see herself as Indian in some ways, but she was born here and America was always the first place of home in a lot of ways for her. I, on the other hand, was born in India and came here before I turned 5. So that means that I had started developing my identity. I had started becoming verbal. I had languages that were not English. I had language fluency in those languages as much as a toddler can. I kind of knew who I was. I understood how to move and be in the world. And then that world changed for me very drastically as I was brought over to the United States. And so that process of being a 1.5er is living in the in-between two worlds, neither of which feel completely like my own, and at the same time are completely where I belong. And so this in-betweenness is really the space that I have spent most of my scholarly time studying, the hyphen, the idea of being Asian American, Indian American, however we want to hyphenate it, and thinking about that space. So I think there's a lot of different points that we can talk about in terms of how we address that hyphen and the ways in which we live in that hyphen. That hyphen marks a space and an identity formation process that is distinct for many different reasons. One, it helps us think about the world, the liminal and the marginal world between Asia and America. Now that's problematic because America isn't really a place, it's an idea. And Asia, we know, is a continent full of many different places. And so the ideas of Asianness are also shaped by that, right? And so what is that middle space like for us? And that's a question that we have to ask. That hyphen is also the space where we think about and talk about the ways in which we understand ourselves here in the United States, especially in relation to identity as it is best understood in the United States, particularly in terms of race. And so where do we belong in the midst of that? So the first thing I want us to think about is that the hyphen is the space where we are navigating all of the time, but it is not a point, it's not a minus sign. Sometimes it feels like a minus sign, but it's not. It is not figuring out or fracturing of the other identities. Rather, it's learning about and understanding the ways we hold those multiple identities in tension with each other. Sometimes they synchronize beautifully and effectively. Other times they may feel like they are asynchronous or bumping up against each other, pushing against each other, and creating an immense amount of conflict. And even beyond that, many times they become their own identity, a merged kind of reality and lived experience that we can share. So in the first place, when we think about the hyphen, I want us to consider the ways in which it is a response to not only our own way of understanding and knowing ourselves, but the ways in which people know and understand what those words mean. So when we say the term Asian American, we're not only navigating the ideas of being of two different cultural spaces, two different national spaces, two different global spaces at the same time, but also the way in which the world makes sense of that. So here in the United States, how do we read Asianness? What does Asianness mean? What are the stereotypes that come with it? In what ways are we in conversation with those stereotypes all the time? whether we believe them or want to or not. Sometimes we're in conversation with those stereotypes by resisting them. Sometimes we're in conversation with those stereotypes by fulfilling them. Sometimes we're in conversation with those stereotypes by just being very confused by them. And then the flip side of that is the American. And the American side of that hyphen is thinking about what is our belonging in this land that we occupy. How are we named in this land? How are we utilized in this land as a resource, as a weapon, as a value, and as a articulation of Americanness itself? So these are all big ideas that take a lot of time to think about. As I said at the beginning, I don't really want to spend too much time talking about theory, but I would like to spend some time using our stories to understand this. I think one of the best ways in order to think about any kind of identity and identity experience is to look at the stories we have and understand how those stories connect us. So I'm going to share a little bit of my own story, and through that, I'm going to share the different experiences. I started off explaining that I was a 1.5er. So the first element I want to utilize my story to share about is the idea of migration. What migratory generation we are shapes how we move into the new location that we live in. For immigrant generations, they often will spend a good portion of their life, maybe even more years of their lives in the new place that they move to, but their sense of identity is still almost completely tied to the land of their birth. That's because that's where their sense of self was most fully established. And so if you were to ask people who migrated or who consider themselves the immigrant generation, they would most likely tell you that they identify as the place of their birth. My parents, my aunts, my uncles, most of them would tell you they are Indian, though most of them have now lived in the United States for more years than they ever lived in India. For the second generation, those who are the children who are born to immigrant populations and are raised in the United States, most of them talk about living hyphenated lives. They say that they are both, they may say they are Indian American, Asian American, etc. And they may have some sort of political leanings around that. But that hyphen is a really important thing for them. They know that they may say at home to their parents, I'm American, and they may say to their friends outside of the home and to the people who they interact with outside of their homes that they are of the cultural heritage they come from, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Hmong, etc. Right? And that question of who we are and what we are has a lot to do with how they get read. Right? So they're maybe getting messages, they're definitely, we're all definitely getting messages that we are supposed to be a certain way. So when we are out in the world, what does it mean to be an American? We know that's coded in racial and class realities about what it means to be an American. As Asian American Studies author Lisa Lowe explains, Asians are often coded as perpetually foreign. And what she means by that concept of perpetually foreign is that we almost never understand Asian populations to have lived in the United States for more than a first generation, for more than one generation. When in actuality, we know our history shows us that Asian Americans have been in the United States for going on 5, 6 generations now. And so one of the questions that comes up very clearly is, when we see Asians in our community, do we understand that they are part of the matrix of the United States? And in what ways do we understand that? Lisa Lowe argues that we always consider the Asian image or the Asian face to be a new arrival in the US, though we know that's not true. Right? This, I think, was exacerbated during the pandemic. We know that there was an increase in anti-Asian crimes in the United States and an intense rise in hate crimes towards Asian American communities, primarily and partly because of the perpetual foreignness and the ways in which that perpetual foreignness has been weaponized historically in the United States. Asian violence has always centered around the notions of disease. So we know that this isn't new, unfortunately. What we experienced during the pandemic and the articulation of Asians as disease carriers is not a new phenomena. We know that we saw that as early as the 1800s with Chinese immigrants into the United States and the idea that Chinese populations brought disease with them, diseases that are not considered curable, that are considered weapons, that are considered acts of terrorist violence towards other populations. In fact, many of the developments of Asia, of Chinatowns throughout the United States, stemmed from originally intended quarantining of Asian populations when they served as migratory labor here in the U.S. And so when we're navigating these identities, right? So we think about how Asianness is read by the dominant culture of our society, and how do we make sense of who we are as Asians? Much of that is in response to what people are asking us, or telling us who we should be. And then we also then have our own journeys and our own stories at home, where we are navigating the sense of what does it mean to be Asian, Chinese, and we know we don't talk about ourselves as Asian in a monolith. We all know that, though we fall into that pattern and that trap with the US kind of language around that. But what does it mean to be Indian? What does it mean to be Pakistani? What does it mean to be Chinese, Japanese, Korean? And our parents at home, with all of their best intentions, definitely had clear ideas about what it meant to be our cultural identities. What we don't often talk about, though, is that their own recollections and their own understandings of what was considered the best ways to be committed to our culture were themselves very nostalgic and selective memories of those ideas. They had left their homelands, they had sacrificed everything, given up a lot to come to this country and build better lives for us. In doing so, there was an immense amount of loss for them. They lost their own cultural centers, whether they acknowledge that or not, whether they experience it or not. They lost their own sense of cultural growth. And what I mean by that is that they were frozen in time. So the India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, China, Korea that they grew up in, right, was one of their memory. So they remember what it was like when they were youth. They leave it. Then the way they remember it when they come to the new place is a bit nostalgic, right? They miss home. And when you miss home, home always tastes a little sweeter, smells a little nicer, and the memories are a little softer. And so their memories were deeply tied to nostalgia. And they don't always remember the ways in which there was complexity, diversity, and difference in the lands that they grew up in. They can talk about it intellectually, but their memories are really steeped in an emotional response, right? And so at home, the children of immigrants often then face the experience of their parents' nostalgic memory and being upheld to the standards of that. This is a pretty tricky place for us when we live in the hyphen, right? So we have a world outside of the home telling us, hey, if you're really this thing, then you should be able to function in this way, which is fed by the stereotypes of a dominant society. And then when we're at home, we get messages about, if you really are a good kid, here's the kind of cultural practices you should be able to engage in. Sometimes those two things are in direct contradiction with each other, right? So I think one of the things that we want to talk about here that I think is important is then understanding that our identities are not actually pieces of a pie that can be divided up in that way, no matter how much it feels like they're divided up or they're closeted, where we're American outside the house, Indian inside the house, right? That kind of closeting and that kind of division isn't actually possible. All of us are all parts of the hyphen at 100% all of the time, whether we can express that or not, and whether anyone else reads it that way or not. And I think this is a really tricky thing. I argue this point in some of my work where I talk about the notions of cultural fusion, explaining that fusion is the idea that we put different identities together into a pot, and we can't actually extricate those varying characteristics away from each other in any kind of saleable way. It's not possible to say, oh, this is my Indianness at this moment, this is my Americanness at this moment. In actuality, it's all of us, all of the time, in all kinds of ways. It may have the flavor of our birth heritage. It may have the flavor of our new home heritage, but in actuality, it is the combination that is the actual articulation of identity. Think about if we were to put milk and water into a cup. Milk is its own thing, water is its own thing. Both hold their own properties, but once you mix them together, you can't tell which is the milk, you can't tell which is the water, and they are a new thing altogether, both continuing to hold their own properties. Another element of this is that much of the conflict that we face as a society when we think about these things is because so much of it is driven by stereotypes. Stereotypes are interesting. Generally, when we talk about them, we can all say, oh, stereotypes are bad. The thing that we often don't think about or haven't considered is that stereotypes are bad regardless of the stereotype. So even if the stereotype sounds positive, Asians are good at math, we've all heard that one. I am proof that that's not true, but we've all heard that one, right? But the idea that it's a positive articulation or a positive characterization of a group doesn't actually make it a good thing. Characterizations that clump a group into a singular way of being are problematic all the way around, because no group is homogenous. There is diversity amongst us. We are all very distinctly different, and our cultural ways of being are distinctly different. Much of that is lost in migration. When migratory communities come over, as I was saying earlier, for our parents' generation, or for my parents' generation, for example, what happens is that they don't remember, because they don't have in front of them the day-to-day immense heterogeneity of their own cultural experience. And so their ideas of what it means to be the cultural thing, whatever that cultural thing is, Indian, Pakistani, Hmong, Vietnamese, etc., right, is narrowed. It's narrowed by a memory, and it's narrowed into a very homogenous kind of articulation of identity. And so we want to be careful with those kinds of stereotypes, even if they sound and feel positive, especially because as we see what happens in the United States, many of these positive stereotypes that we see around Asian Americans are then weaponized against other minority groups, reinforcing the structural racism within the United States, and particularly anti-Blackness, right? This is a tricky space, because being successful and being rewarded for our success feels good. It's important, it's necessary, and it is the purpose behind migration for most Asian American populations. And I'm going to put a little asterisk by that most, because even as I'm talking right now, I'm sort of reinforcing, I'm reinforcing an idea about Asian migration into the United States as though it is a certain kind of migration, when we know in actuality, Asian migration into the United States itself is pretty complex and pretty complicated. Different nations have had different migratory histories, and not all of them have been positive. So the idea of the successful Asian itself is a myth. It's a myth for those populations, and it's actually a myth because not all Asian communities that have migrated have had the same levels of success. And so we want to really think about the ways in which the idea of our success is important. We want to know that we made it. We want to know that our sacrifices, our trials, our tribulations, and our efforts have resulted in something valuable, have resulted in something good, have moved our families, our children, and our communities forward. That's totally human nature. That's a good desire. It's something we want to do. What we have to ask, and the hardest question that we have to ask, is, in doing so, are we then being used as a weapon against other populations to continue to create suffering for other populations? That's a trickier question. And I don't know that I have all the answers to that, but as Sue just said at the beginning, and as I was listening to the cultural centered model that you all were explaining, the center of that is self-reflection, right? Taking the time to think about who we are and how do we fit into this larger race matrix as a society, and what does that mean for us as Asian Americans, right? It's not easy. I don't think it's an easy question, and I would never claim to make it an easy question for any of us. I think it's one of the harder questions we have to ask, and it's hard not just because of the content, but because we can get away without asking it if we want to. And that's what makes it a dangerous question. Because when we ask questions that we're not supposed to ask, we're disrupting the power structures. We're disrupting the structures of oppression that are prevalent around us and that are sort of embedded into the systems that we live in every day. And we want to be thinking about, what does it mean to disrupt those systems? How can we disrupt those systems? And what does that look like, feel like, and what are the impacts of that for us as a society? I want to go back to what I was saying about Asian immigration into the United States. It's important to note that systems of oppression and power structures and power dynamics exist within Asian migration histories as well. So the idea that Asian immigrants have done well in this country is itself a false statement. Particular groups of Asian immigrants have done incredibly well in this country. Other groups of Asian immigrants have not done as well. And oftentimes the stories of those Asian migrations have been silenced. They're hidden histories that we don't often talk about. And the not talking about that is to help reinforce kind of very singular stereotypes about what it means to be an immigrant or a good immigrant in the United States. And so the idea that Asians have, one, of course, didn't have to struggle to come to the US is problematic. They did. Second, the idea that all Asians who came to the United States ultimately succeeded financially, also false and inaccurate. And it's inaccurate in multiple ways. It erases the struggles and the difficulties of Asian populations that did not have economic success. It implies that economic success is interpersonal, that it was just that hard work is all that it takes to be successful in this country. And we know more and more so that that's inaccurate. It definitely takes hard work. Hard work is important, but there are also structures in place that value that hard work differently for different people. Right. And it also belies the ongoing tensions within the home nations. And this is a piece that we often forget, and that is that the cultural crises that existed in the homelands for many of these immigrant populations didn't disappear when they came to the United States, but they did get written out of the longer historical trajectories in the United States. So, for example, as an Indian American, when I come to the United States, as I live in the United States and talk about my Indianness in the United States, my understanding of what it means to be Indian isn't absent from the historical struggles that existed in India for my community and my family. And so I have to acknowledge the ways in which we have religious violence in India against certain populations. I have to acknowledge caste violence and recognize that I hold positions of privilege in terms of both of those identities. As an upper caste Hindu, I have to recognize that the life that my earlier generations, my ancestors lived in India, was coded with a particular kind of privilege. That privilege came with us. Privilege is invisible. It's a knapsack we carry with us all the time. And as we have more and more generations here in the United States of Indian immigrants, and we go into second and third generations of Indians in the US, we begin to see the ways in which that same religious and caste violence is beginning to play itself out here in the United States. And so it gets more and more complicated as we go along. And I think it's really important that we take time to think about that and recognize that. So when we say, for me, and when I do my work, when I talk about being Indian American, I can't just assume that the experience of Indian Americans in this country is the same for everyone, nor can I assume that the ways in which structures of oppression worked in India are not present here in the United States as well, whether they were intended to be or not. I actually don't think we can have a debate about intention. I think that's a slippery slope and not necessarily one that helps when we're having these kinds of conversations, but it is important to say, well, we do see it and it is happening and it is playing out. So what are we going to do to dismantle it? I think that I'd much rather focus on solutions than not. And so given that, I want to talk a little bit about some solutions and what it means to have these conversations, right? So I think the first thing that I want us to think about, doing these kinds of events during Heritage Months is so very important. It is so important to take time to highlight and see those who look like us. Representation matters. And it's also very important to remember this is a first step only. It doesn't matter how much we talk about and celebrate difference if we don't find ways to build systemic support for difference, until difference becomes integrated into our structural ways of being, into our practices, our policies, our procedures at every level. We aren't really doing the thing itself. Asian American studies, cultural critic Edward Said said something really powerful. He said, diversity is a tool of empire. He was a post-colonial studies scholar. And what he meant by that was the empire, whatever the empire is, and he was writing about the Western Empire in terms of the Middle East, in terms of the colonial Raj. What he was saying is empire will use diversity. It will celebrate diversity to make sure that it remains intact. The celebration of difference is not the same thing as the acceptance of difference. And I think that's really important. And so I think one of the mandates that I will put forth to the leadership at Henrico County Public Schools is, how do we move from celebration of difference, right, to the acceptance and integration of difference into our societies? I absolutely think that Henrico County Public Schools has been doing some of that. I know that, Suja, you'll have to help me with the timeline. I don't know if it's been a year or 2 years that we've incorporated multiple religious holidays into our calendar. Has it been 1 year or 2 years? 2 years? Okay, great. So 2 years where we've been getting days off for Diwali and Eid, Rosh Hashanah, and various non-Christian holidays. That is definitely a way in which we're not just celebrating, but incorporating difference into our society. I hope we're having conversations about what those holidays are, though I know that, when we're in school, holiday is holiday and we'll just celebrate it no matter what. But we want to see that, so one of the steps is to move from celebration into integration. A next step that is internal, intrinsic, and individual is doing the work of our own self-reflection. What do we mean when we say, I am, and finish the sentence? When I say I am Indian American, what am I saying? Who am I saying it to? What is the purpose of that message? And how do I internalize that for myself? In what ways am I both internalizing the beauty of it and the violence of it, right? That's the hard question that we have to ask. It's not an easy thing to do. And to think about the ways in which, in response to one structure of oppression, are we upholding a different structure of oppression? That's tricky. I don't know that we have all the answers. I know I don't have all the answers. I will say that right off the bat. But what I can promise is that we can keep having the conversations. Having the hard conversations matters. So that's actually 2 steps: self-reflection, asking yourself those questions. And the second step is having those conversations with others who are like you, who are similar to you, to think about those questions in ways that you might be able to find some answers together collectively. And then also having those conversations with people who aren't like you, so that you can show what your difference is like in its most complex and its most beautiful and intricate manner. Right. I think I'm gonna stop there, because I bet that you all in the audience have some great ideas yourself, and I'd really like to open this up for conversation. And I think I've left us some good time to engage in dialogue.
We're right on time, so I don't know how you want to do the questioning, Tiffany, or
they can put it in the chat. I'll put the chat up.
Yes, and as part of the registration process, our registrants were given the opportunity to pose questions during their registration.
Awesome.
We did not receive any via the registration form, however, so we typically like to have questions directed in the chat.
Okay.
And so we can kind of monitor that.
But you know what? I'm going to start off with a question for you, just to get the dialogue going. What do you see as one of the barriers for, I guess, the AAPI community, when you said that, we're constantly seen as the perpetual foreigner, right? What do you think that in general our communities, I guess we do without knowing, that continually put us in that place?
That's a great question, Suja. And I think, Suja, you and I are really good examples of a way to think about this, right? So both you and I are 1.5ers, right? We were both,
No, I'm
you're
not. I'm
second
actually.
generation. You're
Mhm.
second generation, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So like I said, I was born in India, raised in the United States. Suja, you were born here in the US,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
And so I think that one of the things that we do, one of the ways, and I'm going to be careful. I want to speak particularly to about the South Asian community because that's where my research is, right? I don't want to
Yeah.
make the assumption that the research that my research can be generalized to other Asian American populations, though
Mhm.
my research, though the work I've done indicates that this is similar. It threads similarly through other Asian populations. How it looks might be different, but conceptually it's the same, and that is similar. That is that we fall into the model minority myth pretty easily, right? So we fall into this idea that the best way to survive in this country is to hold ourselves apart, to be a insular community, a community that knows its place, that succeeds tremendously when we know our place, right? But that knows its place, and so we've held ourselves sort of separate, and I think that's changed and is changing. So second and third generation community members I see pushing and getting more involved in multiple ways. And I think that was a hard shift, right? So when we think
Mhm.
about immigrant generation adults, parents, it was really hard for them when their kids were like, okay, we're going to go out there and be really visible around an issue or around a topic. And I think the instinctive reaction was, don't do that. Like we came here, we gave everything up to succeed in this country. Don't put us in the crosshairs, kind of thing, almost literally, right? In the crosshairs around this kind of stuff. And so I think that that's one of the ways our communities have internalized the issue, the kind of the way of saying disengaged, right? And so, and I want to be clear, when I say get engaged with our society, I don't mean just around the issues that are central to our community, but recognizing that we are part of the American landscape. So how are we getting engaged to the larger, right, American landscape? Great. I think it's amazing that we're talking about the issues that are connected to our religion, that are connected to our cultural heritage, that are connected to our success as a community. But we are also part of the larger landscape. Are we participating in the political processes around issues that we are told aren't for our community?
Hmm.
Right?
Do you think that that could be seen as losing their identity or losing their culture or losing part of who they are because they're attaching to something? Do you know what I mean?
I absolutely do. I definitely think that's one of the narratives. I
Mhm.
think that the articulation of it is that isn't our, I think it's a twofold, right? And this is where it gets tricky. I think we've conflated heritage with the model minority identity. So it's like it's collapsed, right? And so that collapsing of that, so and I write about this a lot, this idea of being the good Indian daughter, right? And I know you have similar story, you have shared a lot of these stories. So the good Indian daughter, that articulation, what falls into that, what's the defining characteristics of that, actually is a real interesting hodgepodge, right, of social control, right, making sure that I obeyed my family's wishes, cultural heritage, components of my cultural identity, and thinking about how to be, what has been passed down from generations from my ancestors, right? The richness of my own heritage. It's also reinforcing US standards of Indianness, right? And immigrantness. And so all that stuff and it's all, collapsed into and truncated into that one phrase: if good Indian daughters do blank, fill in the
Right.
blank, right? And
Right.
so and another layer of that I've read, it's also caste driven. It's also
Mhm.
language driven, linguistic
Mhm.
and regional driven, right? So like my sense of
Right.
good Indian daughter definitely taught me a certain kind of caste privilege.
Right. Right. Right.
And then when we
Yeah.
don't live in our homelands, there's no counter story, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
when and again, when I say all of this, this is not done with malintention by anybody, right? This is
Mhm.
not about malintention. This is about protecting our families. This is about sharing our history with our families. This is about having, building identity. So I want to be really clear. It's not malintention, but it can backfire, right? But I'm not in India. So when my grandma would say to me, good Indian daughters do X, I couldn't be like, okay, then go to school and have like 15 other girls who were classmates be like, no, that's not what we do, right? And
Right,
then
right.
I just had no foil. Does that make
Right,
sense?
right. Of course, yeah. So we have Denorio Rios, and she's asking, hi, thank you very much for being here. My question is, how can we help our children to understand the impact they have entering to new experiences in school in USA?
That's a great question, Denora. Thank you so much for asking. I think that this is a tough thing for parents to do because parents want to protect their children, and rightfully so. But I think a part of what parents have to do is be ready to have the hard conversations and know that they don't have the answers, right? I think that, it's so empowering to children to hear their parents say, hey, you are in a different place than I'm in. Let's talk about that and let's find a way through. Right. I think that that's a really important piece of it. So I think that, and I want to make sure I'm understanding your question correctly. I, I, I think it's both things. So help your children by willingly sharing how your experience is different than theirs, right? But also honoring and recognizing that when your children tell you what their experiences are, allowing them to own those experiences, right? And imbuing in them a sense of belongingness to their own cultural identity without, and I think that's tricky. I think all parents want to do that and maybe think they do, right? But the truth of the matter is the ways in which our next generations are members of our cultural groups looks and feels different. And so we have to be careful not to be saying to them, I don't know if that's, are you being, I don't know if that's very Indian, or even having those conversations inside our heads. Actually, it's just as Indian as, as we are. So my nieces and nephews, right? They're just as Indian as their parents are. And they're just as Indian as I am. And, it looks different. It feels different. It functions differently, but it's still a belongingness. I hope that answers the question. I see another question. I'm actually, one other thing that I'm going to say to Denora is I think it's really important, and this was really empowering experience for me. I went and started learning about my own cultural identity outside of my family. It changed the trajectory of my own experience culturally. I stopped counting on my family to be the ones to teach me about my own cultural history, and I started reading about it on my own. And exploring it. And that was incredibly powerful. And I think it'd be amazing for parents to do that with their children, because a lot of us who are of older generations had a lot of cultural, what I call cultural osmosis. It just sort of was in the air around us, and that's where we got it. But we don't know it either, right? And so what does it mean to go and read and learn and let ourselves be scholars of ourselves? I think that's pretty powerful. So there's another question. Can I read it out loud, Suja?
Sure, go ahead.
All right. So I think, given that our stories are not told as often, what advice do I have for girls of color in terms of thriving and excelling in fields typically not seen for people of color, in terms of navigating society and parental expectations? I love this question, partly because that is my story. I am obviously a young, not young, but I'm obviously a 1.5 generation Indian American. Was definitely expected to be in science, and if not science, then in engineering, and if not that, then maybe law. That was about as far out as I could go. I ended up getting 3 degrees in communication studies and do work in diversity. So really not anywhere near the trajectory of any Indian person than anyone ever expected. And I think that most of my family still, a lot of them just scratch their heads and they're like, we don't know. She does it. She's really good. We like it. And they don't know what they're talking about. So it's all good, right? So I think a couple of things. One is that our own cultures are incredibly vibrant and diverse. So go back to the origins, like get outside of the colonial read of our culture, right? And read the counter stories that were there, the stories of resistance and revolution from those colonial times. So for me, for example, I do this work, and yes, much of my training around social justice, especially in a U.S. context, came from the work and the reading and learning that I did through Black feminist writers and U.S. Black feminist writers and scholars and activists. But in conjunction with that, I started reading about the people who fought the colonial fight in India, right? Both men and women, non-binary folk. I learned so much about how the ideas that everyone told me were American ideas had roots in my own history. And that was really powerful. So I really, really encourage families to go and young women of color to go and find your own ancestors who were also these warriors. They're there. They're in every single culture. It is a myth of colonialism that tells us that the fight for justice is a white fight, right? That is just not true. It is so powerful in our own history. So I encourage you to go and find some of those stories, and so that you can then, use those models to support you, to sustain you. And in my case, tell your family, oh no, I learned it from this person over here. It's totally part of our culture, right? And so that helps, right? So I think that and then I think the last part of that question, in navigating society and parental expectations, I really like the way you worded that, because it is just a navigation, right? It's not, they don't have all the answers, nor are they completely wrong. It's just about finding your footing so that you can hold your center and asking those questions of yourself. I also think it helps to have conversations with others. Representation matters. We have these conversations. I'm not sure if the person who asked this question is a parent or a student, but I'm here. No, not. This is weird. I'm not here right now. I'm almost always in Richmond, and I'm available and I'm around. I'm happy to have these conversations. I'm happy to continue these conversations. Doing the work in our communities is important and for me a priority. So would love to keep having those conversations. I hope that answers the question a little bit. And I think the last thing I would say is, when people asked me questions, I wish I had asked questions back instead of trying to find a way to defend myself. Like if I could, when someone would ask me, well, what are you're doing? I think I assumed what I knew what their question, what drove their question. And that was a mistake sometimes, right? So I think I wish I had been able to respond. And I'm talking to like my 15-year-old self, my 20-year-old self, right? I wish I had been able to respond and say, can you tell, what are you asking? I want to understand your question better so I can answer it better. Because maybe they were literally asking like, are you safe? Right? And I didn't even realize that that's what they were asking. I could have answered that, but instead I might get defensive. I was feeding the stereotype myself by assuming that they were stereotyping me and then defending myself. I think that was a lot, but right.
Again, I don't know if she's, if it's a parent or a student. Oh, she's a student.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, that's good to know. I think it's really hard. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think the students have much more pressure when they're in high school and college. I think, when I look back, I went to Godwin, so, they didn't have these other pressures that they have now, right? And I feel like the AAPI community in particular is much more, a little bit more, and I can say the Indian Pakistani community, they're much more put a lot more pressure on the kids, right? And I think that it's very hard to navigate around the parental expectations. And it's a lot. It's a lot. I mean, the community, the this, the that, whatever it is that's going on. And I feel that it's very, very, and it's just, what is it? Is it AAPI boys right now are the highest risk for suicide, right?
That's right.
So, it's a conversation. I think that, I mean, I'm glad she asked that question, and I hope that, they can continue to have those type of questions and just kind of, but it's a lot. It's
I
and
think, Suja, you're hitting on something really, really, I think hard for us to talk about as a community, but
yeah,
really important. And that a, a generation ago, time-wise, right? So when you and I were coming up, right, our population numbers were not as high. So though they were high, right? Indian and Pakistani immigrants have always been on the higher end of immigrant numbers in this country, right? They were high, but they weren't as high. And so our population was a bit more diffuse. And so the pressures that our parents' generation felt to conform to cultural social standards were diffuse. So sure, they felt pressure, right? To, the ongoing, like in the South Asian community, like the uncle auntie competition, right? Like, oh, my child's doing this. Oh, my child, and I feel like all Asian families do this, but right? Like, so my child's doing this. Like that was a little more diffuse for my parents, right? Because the population wasn't as big. Maybe they weren't in the population as much, right?
Right.
That's changed. That's changed by sheer volume.
Oh,
the communities are so big.
Yeah.
So that pressure. So I think that there's the parents fall under that pressure of, how do I explain who my child is in my own community in ways that that reads as successful. So that, I think that's I want to set that landscape before I answer the question. Because the way I'm going to answer the question, I think, is gonna take us in a different direction here. That itself is our own, right? Is our own sort of ingested colonialism, in which we have literally sort of, as a community, drank the Kool-Aid about fulfilling standards that are hyper performative of success. And they're damaging and they're dangerous for us as a community, right? And the thing that is so, I think, that we have to understand is that I'm not saying this doesn't happen back in our homelands, right? So it's not like in India, there isn't that kind of performative pressure, but that performative pressure lives up against a diverse sense of Indianness. So it is then diffused in particular ways. And because the entire society is Indian, it is having its own conversations about the ways in which Indianness is both fruitful and damaging, right? Here in the United States, right, we're not just, it's not a fully Indian or Pakistani or South Asian society or Asian society, right? So then there's no diffuseness. There's no like, okay, this community over here pressures its kids and this one does, like, it's none of that. Like, oh, we hang out with these friends who are really, create a lot of pressure and not, but we're tired of those friends. We'll go hang out with these people who have a whole different take, right? Like, I mean, like, even Anika's question is brilliant. Like, there are, the idea that Asian folks don't produce literature and theater and dance and revolutionaries blows my mind, right? Like, where did we ever come up with that idea? Just the question itself reveals it, right? And so the idea that this isn't a place for our women. Okay. I can't even begin to start naming all the people, right, that prove that wrong. And so so there, it's not diffuse. So we come into this to the homeland, and what happens here is that the cultures are insular. They turn inward, and they only we tend to socialize amongst ourselves, right? in that socialization, there's a very narrow articulation of success and a very narrow articulation of cultural authenticity, right? Which creates a pressure cooker, right? And it reinforces the various stereotypes that are going to be very damaging to us in the long run, right? And maybe even in the short run. I mean, the way that racial violence is playing out in the U.S., if the time gaps are, I mean, the gaps between acts of racial violence decrease exponentially across all populations. And so we've got to really, I think that we've got to start having our own conversations in our own communities about how we have really ingested a very colonial read of ourselves that is an internal poison in some ways.
Great. Yeah, so let's see here.
Yeah, I actually have a question. This discussion is just so rich. Dr. Paddock, I have a question for you, and you kind of touched on it, I think, in what you were just saying, but what advice, so I'll say this way, as a Black person, as a Black educator, oftentimes I have discussions with colleagues, with non-Black educators about what education represents to Black families and to Black households, right? That although it represents this sense of empowerment, it also represents a system or an institution that has been linked to oppression for many Black people, right? And so for a lot of educators, being cognizant of the idea that like the way that we show up to those families is no different than professionals in other systemic institutions, right? Like the way that they perceive a teacher, or the way that my grandmother perceived a teacher was no different from how she perceived her doctor or her lawyer. It was the same concept, right? We represented this heightened sense of education. And so because of that, sometimes there is an absence of those families and those parents in the engagement with educators and with school leaders, because education represents an institution that they are not ready or trained to challenge or to inquire about or to raise to a different standard, right? It is the idea that like I send my kid to school, you do what's expected of you, you make good grades, and that's it, And so what advice would you give to some of our educators just about how to create just the appropriate learning environment for all students, but particularly for Asian American students, and how to engage with Asian American parents and families?
So I think that it is imperative that we are teaching the people's history of the US all the time, especially to those of us who consider ourselves a part of the US. I think the US is woefully undereducated about its own people's history, right? And I want to be clear, not because we choose to be, but because we were trained to be, right? Toni Morrison wrote about this back in the early 80s, in a Time magazine article when she was asked to talk about different racial groups in the United States. And one of the things she said is that to be an Asian immigrant into this country is to know that you should distance yourself from Blacks. And it was one of the most powerful things that she wrote. It was just an essay in Time magazine. And what she was articulating there is that my immigrant populations were told to distance themselves from Black US history. And so they did, not understanding why or how or what it meant. And so then they became weaponized, right, in the war of anti-Blackness. And so that becomes a real problem. So I think that one thing is to step back and to say, this is a history that you need to know, right? Not because it's not in a kind of competitive way between cultural groups, but because this is the land you now live in, right? This is about where this all comes from. I also think that, and then I would also say the inverse of that, right? So I would encourage educators to also learn about the ways in which colonialism outside of the US played out, because that idea of the distrust of the institution isn't that far removed from the experiences of, at least in my own family, I would say, like, of my family who remembers living under the British Raj, right? Even if they were children, they were taught to distrust institutions. And when I hear them tell those stories, I'm like, wow, that sounds a lot like the African-American and Black elders that I talk to who talk about the distrust of institutions in the United States. It's like, and so I think there's threads of similarity and transcendent shared realities that building those connections, I think, is a great way to do that, right? But that's obviously a long game, right? That takes time to learn and educate each other. I think that a shorter answer is to encourage people to ask questions rather than assume they understand why anyone is making the moves and decisions that they're making. So when I talk to non-white, non-Black educators about the lived experiences of the students that they work with, I tell them, ask why something is happening, because you may not know what's happening in that family or in that community. And to assume that you do, reveals that you're buying into a dominant narrative that is probably pretty dangerous right now for the other person, but someday maybe even for you. Right. And I think that becomes really important. Like, I don't believe, unfortunately, I wish I could say differently, given the cultural shifts that we are going through, given this moment of time that we're in terms of the cultural wars in the United States, I don't believe that any group is safe if they're not part of the dominant group, defined broadly. Right. And so I think the best way is to really have the conversations in very open-ended ways of questioning rather than just assuming. I hope that sort of helps.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
We maybe have
someone's hand. Someone's hand is raised.
Oh,
I think.
yes.
Yeah.
May I ask another question, if that's all right?
Sure.
So, firstly, it's been amazing hearing, someone that looks like me talk about these issues, because I personally am very interested in both, like critical race theory and feminism, and it's something that I've looked into on my own time. So just hearing someone, discuss the intersectionalities of that has been amazing. I was wondering if you had any thoughts kind of on the prioritization that at least I personally have seen, particularly in Asian families, on finances equating to happiness and the narrative that kind of creates. Because in my own family, the way I've been raised kind of has been to think that, if I make anything less than 100K as an adult, I can't survive, or that I'll be unhappy, or that I'll have a terrible life, which I'm sure, isn't 100% correct, but it's something so ingrained in me. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that. Thank you.
Anika, thank you so much for asking that question. And I don't know if you noticed, but both Suja and I started laughing, and I didn't know what was coming. I should not have taken a sip of my Coke when you were asking the question. I'm living proof that you'll be just fine without revealing any more information than that, but you'll make it. I went into college, just a quick funny story, and then I'm going to answer your question. When I said I wanted to teach and I was going to be a university professor, my whole family started talking about me doing a noble job because that was code for it's not the money-making job, right? And so it was just a running joke. But, I think that in all seriousness, I think that that's a great place to start having conversations with your elders about the idea that so much of how model minority is defined is through fiscal success in the capitalist model. There is a lot of the literature looks at this idea, and Sandhya Shukla actually started this work she started writing about this in the early 90s, the work is continued in the Asian American Studies research around class ascendancy is equated with racial erasure. And that's true, by the way, for other groups, not just in Asian American families, right? So there's been writing around this in terms of African American, because model minority, the term model minority was first originally used for particular kinds of African Americans in particular class, African Americans of a particular class during civil rights. And so some of what is coming through, right, isn't as, it's the narrative is told you have to make this much money to be successful. And if you don't have this much money, you won't be happy, right? But I think there's an underlying unspoken narrative about racial protections in this country come through class ascendancy. And so if you are class secure, you will be racially protected. Now conceptually that's disintegrated. We know that to be utterly untrue, right? But we don't have enough evidence and we don't have enough day-to-day interaction to show that, because so much of the ways in which post-1965 immigrants in the United States were shown the notions of successful immigration or successful migratory communities was shown through class, which is coded language around race. So it was like, look, these people are, if they were if they would just do their work and learn how to be good workers, they would have money and they wouldn't be unhappy. And then we don't mistreat people because of their race. If people just work hard, they'll be okay, right? So this is all part of the complexity of the bootstrap myth, right? And so what I think that's so much of the underlying message. And so I think that warrants a conversation in families. Like when we say that money will make us happy, what are we really saying? Like, I mean, there's a second spiritual conversation. I'm not having that one here, right? But I think that I think that historical piece is really, really important. It also is important to think about what kinds of class status our families had prior to coming to the US, because class ascendancy as caste ascendancy was also a thing, is also a thing in India. And there's a way in which fiscal success gets equated with the Brahmanical turn, with this sort of Brahmanicizing of society. So there are layers upon layers of this that we want to look at. And I think that when we start hearing those kinds of conversations, it's like, okay, one, I hear you that you want me to be happy and safe. Great, thank you. But can we have a conversation about how did this like magic number or this particular white collar framework become, right? Or this STEM driven white collar framework become the premise of sense making, right? And how much of that is from our own cultural history that we brought with us from our homelands, and how much of that is, tied into the model minority myth here. I think I went a little theoretical on you there, so I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm happy to talk more about it.
It did. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your answer.
Sure.
I wanted to add one more thing, because, when you were talking about that, and I know we have only a few more minutes, but I was thinking about how so much of that could also be, and again, this is just theoretical because I'm not a researcher here, but how much of it is from colonialism and how much the British stole from, because and I'm going to just put it in the chat, but like how much they stole from India. It was like 45 trillion. There was so much of the communities that were taken, like they were just basically stolen, and then you think about how the British, just in general with colonialism, stole from so many different communities, whether that's India, whether that's Africa. And then they're making this story, this narrative, like, okay, pull yourself up from your bootstraps. But really, you just didn't work. You just were handed stuff when you came here. But like, it's this idea of perpetuating something that really
that's definitely part of it, right? Like, and that is that because wealth, material wealth, was stolen by the colonizers from the colonized peoples. One of the things that all colonized peoples learned was to hoard wealth in protective ways and to create enough of a cushion, right? So that's part of what I was alluding to, but there are histories there that teach people that the connection between class and safety is very strong. And let's be real, there is a material connection between class and safety. And it is mitigated by then race. And so we have to be careful, right? Class, it is true that money protects us in a certain way. And it is also true that no amount of money will protect you, depending on who you are. And so holding both truths at the same time is it's a conflicted narrative.
Right. And I see that someone is typing, so I want to give that a minute. But
while
do you want to just ask your question? Do you want to just ask? Oh, here we go.
Here we go.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on integrating Asian American kids into the American culture to make it easier for Asian American kids to be successful in school, such as dating, which can be culturally complicated? That's a polite way of saying it. Eating American food, and eating football. You know what? I think that this idea that they are not already integrated is one that I'm going to push back on. I think that it's, I think that the idea that something is American food or Indian food or American food or Asian food, right? Let's put dating aside, because dating goes into a whole different world. Like, that's a whole different hour to say the least. I don't know that we can open that door right now, but I do think that I think that there are ways to think about how cultural fusion works in our society. So we know that, even within one generation, like various Asian foods have become so much more commonplace, right? So one can enjoy them, one cannot enjoy them. The truth of the matter is that we have preferences and taste preferences in all different kinds of ways. And so interpersonally, individually, I think that we can think about those things and kind of disconnect them from being cultural statements necessarily, but we also know that they are cultural statements. And I'm not sure if this is the direction that the question is going, but I also think that we want to be careful that we don't presume that we don't, we're using the word integrating Asian American kids into the American culture. I'd be very careful around assimilation, because the research clearly shows that assimilation ultimately becomes very problematic and difficult, because that it ultimately leads to some kind of erasure. And so I think that there are different ways to do it, right?
I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm assuming this is a parent, right? So, like, I can tell you, when my son was in elementary school, and I walked into his lunch room, and when I was in school, there was only like 2 of me, and like, and when by the time he got to elementary school, there was like 70%, 60% of the school was looked like him, right? Walked in the lunchroom, and it smelled like Indian food, and I'm like walking by, and I'm like, you've got this, you've got that, I'm like pointing out what they're eating, and the kids were so happy that I actually knew what they were eating, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if I went to school and I brought that kind of food, it would not have gone over well, right? Like, I would have probably made fun of. So I mean, I don't really think that, I think that nobody had if kids are feeling a certain way about that, and then my son would come home and be like, hey mama, can you make me biryani, or can you have this, like, I want this for like lunch, like, I want, do you know what I mean? Like, that's what he wanted, because that's what he was hungry for, because he was smelling it. So
I think you're articulating something really important, Suja, which is that it is continuously evolving and shifting, right? So
Right.
Just generationally different at different times. I think that kids tell us what makes them feel safe in those moments. So I think that I think we do have to ask the question, like, it is individual taste and individual preference, but it is also there is a cultural context here. So, when we talk about like what you're eating during lunch, like, that's a cultural performance. The lunchroom is a place that you need to feel safe. You need to, create belonging, and you don't want to do anything that might impede that. And I think that kids are pretty clear about telling you what that might be and what that might look like. And so having those conversations is excuse me, important and good, and just being engaged with our students around that.
Right.
I really,
Well,
I could talk about dating at another time. I think
yeah.
that goes into a whole different conversation. So
Well, thank you so much, Archana. And I think I'm going to hand this back over to Tiffany.
and just really quickly, I want to thank you all for taking time and inviting me to do this. I truly, truly appreciate it. I want to take a minute to give a shout out to my family. I'm in California visiting, and they were generous enough to share me for a little bit of time with all of you. So thank you to my parents and my sister and nephew and family throughout here for letting me take the time to do this. So
Thank you to them for sharing, you with us.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, thank you so much. That was incredible.
Awesome. Awesome. And thank you, Suja, for connecting us with Dr. Paddock. We thank you so much for just your transparency and for, for really being, for enlivening rather some of the work and the programming that we try to make visible for our students. It was obvious through the commentary in the chat and through the questions that students really needed this and that they wanted to have this space. And so we really thank you so much for this just rich discussion. It's just amazing. And so as we continue in this work, we were actually fortunate enough to do this during our Black History Month program and during our Indigenous Peoples, Native American Heritage Month to offer books as gifts to all of our schools. And so you see on the screen that the Office of EDO, Equity, Diversity, and Opportunity, we have purchased the following books for all elementary and secondary schools in HCPS. So our elementary schools are getting Asian Americans Who Inspire Us. Our middle schools are getting Asian American Women in Science. And then our high schools are getting 2 books actually in all of their libraries: The Making of Asian America, which is the text that we had a book discussion on 2 nights ago, and From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry, the story of the killing of Vincent Chin. And so these are works that we hope continue to serve as space for our students to learn and to grow and to challenge and to inquire. And so we are so thankful, Dr. Paddock, again, for just your dedication. Despite your own obligations to your family, we just appreciate you as a community partner and as someone who represents a community stakeholder for HCPS. So thank you so much for that.
I don't think there's anything more Asian American than doing work when you're hanging out with your family. Just hold up a model minority stereotype there.
Well, we certainly appreciate your dedication for sure. Thank you so very much. And I think, is there another slide, Leslie? I'm not sure I can. Oh, okay. It's our thank you slide. There we go. So thank you to our audience for your attention and for your active participation. I mean, really, the audience made this a very interactive experience. So we appreciate you. Let's remember to celebrate AAPI Heritage year round. Again, as we talked earlier, when we talk about our culturally responsive education model, the goal is to look at this as not just contributive, but attributive, and something that is integrated throughout our curriculum, throughout our lens, and how we interact and how we support students. So I hope everyone has a very safe and happy weekend with family and friends. And thank you so, so much. This has been an awesome close to our celebration month. And everyone, I wish you well. Thank you.
I've put my email in the chat. I know there were some students here, and I'm always happy to talk to students as they're navigating their journey, parents as well, but definitely there for all of you. So my email's in the chat. Feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Suja.